we're going to have James Gwertzman with me from A16Z. So obviously, when you have a very awesome track record, you go up the ladder of the rat race, let's say, and then you can definitely forecast where things are going and double on it. So one thing to get away from all of these talks so far is that whatever your expectation in terms of marketing and placement, it's really in the execution that you're gonna start to see what is your game for real. So there's no point to try to do a big business plan. You just release the game. So thank you so much, James, for being here today.
Thank you.
All right. So we have some slides as well to come with this. There we go. Let's wait a little bit. It's going to load up. But in the meantime, so this is the last part of the Photon multiplayer track. And after that, it's going to be about live ops, which is another subject.
Favorite topic.
So by the way, the live ops track here is something that we created like a few years ago when we were building PlayFab. So there we go, Fireside chat with James Gwertzman. Thank you so much for being here today. So as we kick this off, so obviously when you're in the gaming industry for so long, you start at the beginning. And as I was saying just while walking on the stage, is that you have this rat race of being an engineer, then you become a manager, then you become an entrepreneur, and then you become an investor, right? I mean, it's quite a story to get there. I mean, like I first remember meeting James, already 8 years ago or 9 years ago, and already it was a huge story, and now we're just piling up on top of it, and here you are. So I would love to have your take regarding, like, how do you start and get where you're at?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. I can say that there was never like a master plan. I mean, I definitely have always followed sort of passions into and sort of saw wherever it took me. And the one thread that's been consistent through all of the different roles you just talked about was this intersection of art and technology. I've always been fascinated by creating art that is powered by technology. And so that's what got me into computer games. It's what got me into ultimately back-end systems and the technology that powers computer games. And now it's gotten me into investing. I was not looking to leave Microsoft and leave the business I was running using Azure to help build games. But Andreessen Horowitz was looking to hire a general partner to help invest in games specifically. And the idea of being able to step back from running a company to be able to look at the entire industry in all of its breadth to try to figure out where it's going and predict the future, and then use those guesses to figure out which companies to invest in. That sounded really, really exciting.
So you say creativity. So let me backtrack even more. So if you go back in time and like a young James Gwertzman is like, I'm gonna create something that people will like, right? So what was your belief and your assumption, and what did you went through? And then eventually that led to the acquisition by PopCap and all that. So maybe you can start to shape up that mindset.
Yeah, sure. So what Mark's talking about is when I first got started back in 2000, I had been at Microsoft for 5 years. I knew I wanted to, I had done a lot of theater back in high school and college. I did a lot of set design. I wanted to get back to doing something more creative. And so I decided to start a game studio. And I knew that no one was going to hire me to make games, but I was willing to hire myself. And so I decided to leave Microsoft and start my first game studio. Not unlike, I'm sure, a lot of us here who are indies creating our own game companies. It's because we want to create something and we're willing to bet on ourselves. And so I took that leap, and I was lucky enough to get a publishing contract with Sierra Online and get some early work with Valve, and we were able to kind of get something going. What I quickly realized is that there are far better people at making games than me. Like there are just great, much better game creators. And so even though that was my passion, I realized that my value was not going to be actually making games myself. My value was going to be building the cultures and setting up the teams to go and create awesome world-changing games. And so I was able to basically take a backseat role and then build a team and do the fundraising and talk to the partners and all this sort of not very sexy invisible work that has to happen in the back end to actually build a business as opposed to just building a game. And that first company, Escape Factory, unfortunately, when Sierra Online, which was our publisher at the time, they went out of business around 2003, they kind of took us down with them because we did not have another game in the wings, and we lost our funding. But out of the ashes of that, we were able to pivot into casual games, and that became, frankly, a far more interesting business than what was then AAA development. And so we were able to build a couple casual games back to back. One of them was a game called Feeding Frenzy. Feeding Frenzy became actually quite a big hit. And we were then acquired by PopCap. And so once we joined PopCap, same thing happened. They acquired us for our studio, and I came in and said, look, I'm not a great game creator, but I ended up taking on the role of head of business development and sales. And so I became basically traveling the world, helping figure out what to do with PopCap's IP, PopCap's games. Was lucky enough to visit China back in 2005, before free-to-play was being talked about in North America, but I got to visit Tencent back in 2005 when no one in America had ever heard of Tencent before. And I remember seeing them building a bunch of these casual games that were monetized through item sales and thinking, this is amazing. Casual games monetized through selling clothing and cosmetic items. That's really cool. We should be doing that. And of course, at the time, PopCap headquarters was like, that's crazy. No one wants to do free-to-play. That's not an interesting business model. And so in the end, I ended up moving my whole family to Shanghai in 2008 to open PopCap's first ever Asia game studio, specifically to take our PopCap IP and build free-to-play game versions of it. And that's actually where I met, well, actually, we didn't meet until later, no. But that was when I first kind of got exposed to the world of live ops and the world of kind of online game operations. And so we built PopCap China up. Eventually, EA bought PopCap. 2 years after the acquisition, I was ready to move on, and that's when I decided that I'd seen what happened at EA trying to launch a whole bunch of these free-to-play games internally and failing. There's a game called The Simpsons Tapped Out, which launched, I think it was August 2011 or April 2011, and the game launched and hit #1 in the App Store, and they had to take it off of the App Store 5 hours later because the servers had all collapsed. The backend could not keep up with the load at the time. And I remember thinking, wow, if a billion-dollar company can't keep up with the load from the servers on the launch of a successful game, what hope does any small studio have? And that was really the inspiration behind PlayFab and trying to create a unity of the backend, a company that would build backend servers that would sort of magically scale for whatever the load is.
So let me get back a little bit
Yeah,
again. So you were in Shanghai, coming from EA and all that, and then you have Plant vs. Zombie that needs to grow in Asia, and then you start from nothing and building up this huge studio, and then you added 4 studio, I believe, with time. So then you move from the engineer that wants to create to getting acquired, and then you become this manager that will grow an IP, brands in a foreign country, in a different language, with different culture. So what was your mind process through that? Because definitely you're there and like, okay, how am I going to succeed? So what was your approach to be able to unlock the success in Asia for Plant vs. Zombie?
Yeah, so I knew, it's a good question. So China at the time was just as scary for a Westerner to enter as it is now. I mean, China is a huge but intimidating market to try to enter. And I went in with a very sort of humble mindset. I did not think I had any of the answers. In fact, I knew I didn't have any of the answers. What I did have was a desire to learn and a desire to figure it out and a desire to try and meet the market where it was. And so, a lot of Western companies at that time, EA included, had gone into China and spent a lot of money and come in with a very sort of arrogant attitude of, we're going to come into this market and we're going to just, show them how it's done and build games the Western way, and that's going to, win this market. And that was not my approach, because all those companies had failed, and none of them had any real track record of success. Instead, we came in and said, look, we don't know what we're doing, but we're willing to learn, and we partnered with local companies. We hired an entirely local team. Very few expats came over with me. Most of our team did not speak English. That was not a requirement to build that studio. And it worked. We were able to, we in the end ended up building our first big game was Plants vs. Zombies Great Wall Edition, which is the Chinese version of the game. It was the first free-to-play version of Plants vs. Zombies that launched anywhere in the world. We did it on mobile, and we learned so many really interesting lessons about the Chinese market from that game. Like, for example, the initial game when we first launched it, I think it was a 100 megabit download. And and then we kept like shrinking the download. Every time we have the size of the download, we more than doubled the number of downloads. And so by the end, the final game, I think, was like 7 megabytes. It had like no music. It had very poor sound effects. It had much compressed graphics, and it was making way more money and selling way more copies than the initial version we'd sold, which is huge. And was an example of a game built for a Western market that was not finding traction in China.
So you pivoted the game for Asia, and then obviously that led to the success of Plant versus Zombie in Asia and worldwide after that. So you exit that part, and then we met each other in 2013, 14, started PlayFab, which again was quite a story on its own, building that up and growing it. And that led to the acquisition by Microsoft in 2018. And then you stayed as GM for quite a while again. And then you left a year ago, or how long is that?
6 months ago.
6 months ago. Okay, there you go. So through that journey of being an entrepreneur again, so what was the mind shift that you had to do? Because obviously building a startup of that scale is much different, because then you're a service provider. You're not anymore a creator, let's say. So what was your biggest learning of that journey?
Yeah, so you're right. Going from being a game creator and being sort of the person who buys services to being the vendor who's selling services is a real shift. And I was not, I would come to conferences I used to come to conferences like these purely to like see friends and hang out and learn. And then I was coming to conferences like these trying to sell. And that's not always a comfortable role, because you don't want to be the annoying guy who's like, hey, what are you doing? I want to sell you my services. But it's an important point. And I think, again, what made PlayFab successful, or part of what made us successful, was because we all came from a game creator background. We were very much, the attitude was never, we're here to make a lot of money. The attitude was, we really want to make our customers successful. We really are trying to build services that will help games come to market faster, be better. And I'm like legitimately motivated by, I just love tools and services. There's something about sort of service tech that, it's like I'm a woodworker. I like building things with my hands, and I love tools, and good tools unlock creativity in a really exciting way. And given that I'm not the world's best game creator, I've always had this sort of backstage role. And to me, an infrastructure company is the ultimate example of a backstage role, where you are seeing these creative people who have these amazing ideas, and you're giving them like tech, and they take your tools and they do magical, wonderful things with them. And that is such a great feeling when you see someone building something you'd never create yourself with the tools you provide. And I had a chance to do that at PlayFab. And then once Microsoft bought us, and I was helping sort of position Azure for the games industry, doing it on an even bigger scale with an even bigger budget and even bigger team, but same goal, ultimately helping creative game studios be more successful.
That's right. So one key learning is that even if you have a very good business plan and a good idea, it's not until you launch your product that you're going to learn what you have to do. So launch as fast as possible, I think, is the key, both for Plant vs. Zombies and for PlayFab as well. So let's change of subject. So obviously this is the current state of multiplayer. Multiplayer has been very similar through the years, if we go the past 20 years. And now multiplayer, as we see it at Photon, is exploding on mobile, is exploding also in non-gaming for Metaverse and other kind of application. So what do you think it is today, multiplayer, and what should people think about it?
Yeah. So now that I get to wear this investor hat, my job is to now obviously figure out which companies do we think are going to be successful and ultimately invest. And investing is not just writing checks, but it's also about actually trying to help our portfolio companies be more successful by basically coaching. So there's sort of this coaching role that goes with it. When we're investing, we're looking for a very particular type of company to invest on the content side. And to be honest with you, almost every game studio we're investing in is multiplayer. Because part of the reason why a VC firm like Andreessen Horowitz is investing in games, and we were not investing in games as much, say, 10 years ago, is because games have suddenly emerged as this legitimately interesting asset class. I mean, when a game like Fortnite is making $5 billion a year at its peak, that is an investable opportunity, right? And what makes games now suddenly investable in a way they weren't before is I think 4 or 5 things. The fact that games are basically social networks now, right? Games have, the communities, they have social connections, they have friends, they're multiplayer. They are creating ties between people that makes them keep coming back over and over again, right? Games that are multiplayer have inherently higher levels of retention, levels of engagement, levels of monetization, all the things that make for a successful business. So that's number one. Number two, games that are services, or games being run as a service, which means you're not just building it and shipping it, and then once a player has played for 10, 15 hours, they're done. It's a game that can potentially live for 10 years or more. In fact, the best games do. And so that ability to continue operating and investing and managing, it's tied to being multiplayer. It's also tied, of course, to being able to have a live ops model. And live ops, in my mind, is intimately connected with multiplayer because that's what helps create fresh experiences that keeps players keeping that experience.
Yeah, definitely. And we have this thing that live ops was last decade and now multiplayer is this decade. And you mentioned communities. So obviously, one thing that we have seen on our side is that the more you empower your communities, the more value they put into them and the more they grow organically. So what is a good community in 2022 and where this can go? In my opinion, it's still to be written, but what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mentioned already social networks and community. Another thing we're looking for in the companies we invest in is UGC, right? User generated content. Because when you're empowering your players to create content and to sort of enrich the community by giving back, not only is that itself a great form of engagement for certain players, but it's actually making the community stronger because, again, it's new content, it's things that keep it exciting. Players get to talk with each other, they get to give feedback. That is a form of community.
So back when we got acquired by Microsoft, there was an awesome game that you might know called Minecraft. And then Minecraft had a super awesome user-generated content system, which just got released in PlayFab a few months ago. So you guys should look at this to see how you can implement that in your game because it's a turnkey solution and you can do it as well. But communities definitely are going in every direction. One of them is Web3 games and Metaverse. It's very hard to go, and not talk about that simply because of the amount of money that went in the last 12 months. And obviously, A16Z put a lot of tokens on that side. So, what do you think about this current trend, and where do you think this can go?
Yeah. So any conversation of Web3, especially in the games context, is a little bit fraught because depending on where you sit, you may think this is an amazing opportunity to completely disrupt the entire industry. You may think this is a bunch of folks trying to profit from pumping and dumping schemes or something. I think the reality is we have a very long-term view of Web3. We are extremely bullish on the opportunities of Web3 to create to basically decentralize the internet, to basically, we're big believers that what's happening, and it's not necessarily talked about in the press, and it's a little bit behind the scenes if you're not following it very carefully, is a systematic rethinking of all the key systems that basically power the internet. And so when we talk about Web3, this really is this idea that Web 1 was old school build a couple websites and that was your
Static
business
page.
Static pages. Web 2 was players users creating their own content and sort of microservices. And Web 3 now is completely decentralized, where you have every sort of aspect it takes to build a business. You're no longer tied to these handful of sort of key centralized companies, but you can now go straight to end users. So for example, one of the most famous ones everyone talks about is NFTs, right? And the idea that you can actually own digital content. And I think they often, are very controversial because there's a sense of, NFTs are, have these crazy sky-high valuations and that gets all the press. What I think is much more important than the fact that these NFTs have high valuations, the fact that you actually can now create digital content that anyone can actually own and provably say that's mine, that asset actually tracks back to me in a way that is able to go across any game, any community, any portal. It sort of slices horizontally across all the different walled gardens. And that's really where I think we start to talk about metaverse here. I think the real opportunity we have in gaming is to get away from walled gardens, right? Traditionally, games have been these very, very closed environments where everything happens inside the game is completely controlled by one company and one company only. And even the sense of who I am as an identity is usually different in each different game. There's no way to tie across these. My friends' network is not tied across these different games. My assets certainly not tied across these games. And the ability to start to break these up and say, okay, I have an identity that can jump from game to game to game. I potentially have assets that can jump with me if it makes sense for the game. I can have friends that come with me. All of these are things that can get unlocked as you move to the world of Web3. And so that's where we see a lot of the really exciting opportunities. And there are so many smart people working in Web3. Part of why there's so much buzz here is because there's a lot of people who are going into it, and not just because, for the most part, not because they think this is an opportunity to make money, but because they actually see a wholesale revolution happening in terms of the technology and a really exciting opportunity to come in and build brand new infrastructure from the ground up, which I think is, it's like we're reinventing a lot of the basic machinery all over again, and that's a very exciting time.
So definitely, and another key point is that it's generated content, user-generated content, which touched back pretty much the other point before, is that you release something and then you figure out if it works or not. But ultimately, if you give the power to the end user to create whatever they want, they will after that market themselves as well, which is extremely good organically in many ways. And so the obviously Metaverse on our side, we see a lot of non-gaming going Metaverse. In terms of Web3, or should I say pay to win, or being able to redraw money from a game. There was the auction house story from Diablo that was a nightmare if you go back in the days, Diablo, and a few other examples. So it's going to be interesting what is the key sauce over there, but there's still a lot of discovery to be done. So obviously, like, these are new techs. Technologies that are available, but then there's so many new tech that are sprouting everywhere. So for example, there's cloud gaming, there's developing in the cloud, there is tech regarding compression, there's the old DeFi movement, decentralized finance that we've just talked about. So what do you see in terms of tech that has been on your radar and saying, okay, that's a new take on your spin?
So there's 3 tech innovations that I'm spotting that I think are really important that we should all keep an eye on. The first is AI for content generation. I think that if you think about games, they keep getting bigger, they keep getting more expensive to build. The metaverse is going to bring even more people into the world of trying to create 3D online content, and it's expensive to build this content. And yet at the same time, we're starting to see AI tools now emerging that are incredibly powerful in their ability to help create new content. So there's a company out there called Kinetics that can take it used to be if you wanted to create an animation of a character, you either did it by hand, which is very hard to make it look realistic, or motion capture, where you had to put someone in a suit with all these little, photo reflective balls on them and have them, move into space with a whole bunch of cameras. And it's a very expensive proposition to capture motion capture data. There are companies out there now that can take any video, like any YouTube video, and just from the video turn that into an animation that you can then put into a game on a character animation. It's still in its early days, but it works and it's amazing. And this is the early days. Imagine a few more years down the line once it's matured. I think we really will be able to take any video and just capture animations straight off of characters. Similarly, 3D objects. I've seen tech now where they can take any object, a couple of photographs of an object, and turn it into a fully rendered 3D model in a way that bypasses the need to kind of manually create the mesh. So I think those kinds of tools are coming. There's the famous DALL-E demo from OpenAI, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's this amazing image generator where you type in a textual description of what you want, and it gives you an image. And again, it's just more like a proof of concept, but it starts to imagine the day when the artist is not creating content by hand, but working with the computer like an assistant. So saying, give me an island. And like, no, make it a little taller over here. Now add some palm trees. Now make it water. No, I want a storm. I want a boat shipwreck. And then, the computer is working with you to create the scene until you're basically done. And now you've got your entire 3D environment built out, and it was all done by basically talking to the computer and telling it what you want. I think we're getting there. And so I think that's one whole very exciting area, is this notion of sort of computer as AI assistant helping you, the creator, build your game. So that's one category. Another category that I'm really interested in is rethinking the content production process by moving to the cloud and making it cloud native. So I think if you think about how games get built today, they're still very much built in the old school model where you download all these assets to your machine, you build it all locally, you check in code to maybe GitHub or Perforce or something. The art assets live in a giant shared network drive somewhere. You can never find the asset you're looking for. Building the game takes 10 to 14 hours if it's a huge game, and it's an incremental process is slow. I think we're rapidly getting to the point where the game engine lives in the cloud, all your assets live in the cloud. What you're playing is simply a stream off of the cloud, so you're not having to ever actually download anything to your local machine, and build times are instantaneous. And you no longer have to do all those like awkward exporting of layers. You take your Photoshop file, upload it straight as a PSD file. In the back end, it strips all the layers out automatically, turns them into textures. Everything's managed for you. It's all version controlled. And when you check in an asset, within a few minutes, it's already in the game. And because it's all running in the cloud, you can do configuration changes on the fly and see the updated changes in real time. And then you can have potentially, if you're on a conference call with your colleagues trying to review a game, you're all able to watch the same game off of a single URL in real time and see literally the exact same feed together, which is increasingly important when we're in this increasingly decentralized remote workforce environment. So I think that's coming, and I think that's coming pretty fast. And I think pretty soon we're going to laugh at the fact that we ever had to hit sync and go away for an hour and wait for a bunch of files to download to our computers before we could actually get to work each morning. Because I think that's coming fast.
And then you have the third one you said.
Yes, and the third one is in the space of sort of multiplayer, and just the idea that yes, we've mastered a few dozen players, we've mastered a couple hundred players. I think we really are getting to a world where if we want to, we're going to be able to have tens of thousands or millions of players, and obviously not every game is going to benefit from that, but for the ones that do, for these massive virtual environments, I think it's going to be pretty transformative, and not just have millions of players together in online spaces, but be able to have computers helping us look for looking for toxic behavior, looking for harassment, looking for things that make these less safe spaces than we want to be in.
So mainly elements about creation with AI. I saw some really awesome libraries working as well. What I saw on my side is AI QA. So you have like your character NPC and whatnot that is just you just bombarded with ML, and that way you can find a lot of bugs really fast in your game. And then same way to create bots that are a player, like literally a player. So those are growing as well. Super good insights. So obviously, when you go into those categories, which are tools that are not necessarily available today, so you need to build them up, make them available, make sure it works. So there's risk involved to it. So how do you manage risk in terms of both investing in those service stories, but also in those games that wants to create something that is new, that never been seen before?
Okay, that's a tough question. I know one way to manage your risk is, I call it kind of, run early, run often. Like when you're building your game, and this is probably common sense now, but just have it playable from day one and make sure it's always playable, and just continually incremental improvements, where as you're adding innovations, as you're trying new things out, you're able to continually be trying them out and playing them in the game, never getting too far between sort of playable versions of your game. So I've seen a lot of games that end up going off the rails. It's because a game wasn't playable for 6 months or a year because they were making some huge change that sort of broke everything. And so staying disciplined about always being able to play your own game while you're building it is a really important way to do it.
So how will you quantify a company that does that very well? Do you expect them to, for example, give a form to their players or users to fill to tell if they're happy or not? So what kind of tooling or approach that they need to implement for you to be satisfied regarding the way they first launch their service or product?
Well, I mean, as an investor, when you're talking to game studios, you can just ask them, how often do you play your own game? And the best ones, like every Friday we have, for a couple hours we all like stop what we're doing and play the game together. And that's pretty consistent. If you see teams that are playing their own games during development and really having a good time, that's a good sign. If the teams are like, oh no, we don't, it's not running, or we can't run it, or it'll be a year before we can play this game, that's a little bit more of a warning sign. And then for the games that are already, a lot of other companies that have games that are already live, the ones who do weekly updates and are continually updating the game. You and I were talking in the hall earlier about a company called Kabiri Games, aka Fluffy Fairy Games. Yeah. They were great. We loved them because they literally shipped an update every week. And we watched back at PlayFab, we would watch their MAU, their monthly active players grow, month after month after month. It just consistently kept growing because they were so focused on continual innovation, continual updates to that game. So that is another way to manage your risks, is don't sort of wait for these massive monolithic updates that where you hope it's going to work out, and if you're wrong, you've just burned 6 months of your dev time. But by doing incremental updates, you're continually able to measure how you're doing and see how the game is.
So the game of Fluffy Fairy Games is Idle Miner Tycoon. And the way they were doing it is that they were releasing a feature for 5% of their players, and then they were monitoring how they were iterating, if they were successful, and they were judged, do we pull it out or leave it in for the whole crowd. So that's one approach to manage risk, and it's been successful for them, and I'm sure it's going to be successful for others. So obviously gaming is here to stay. We saw it during COVID. Fun makes people happy, right? And gaming is a good vertical, definitely. So do you think that gaming will go beyond games? Meaning that obviously the year 2000, we heard about gamification this, gamification that. What we see on our side is that education, healthcare, and other verticals are also being influenced by gaming. But my question is really more about gaming content and devices. So where do you see this going? So we talk a bit about AI, obviously, but what's your vision on that?
Yeah. So first of all, you just now talking about sort of gaming moving to these other industries, and I think that is one of the really, really important features of gaming. Is I think the metaverse is coming. The metaverse will be built by game companies on top of game technologies, but will be used by sort of all industries. It will not be used by just gaming. And we already see this. We see interior design companies using gaming technology to do virtual walkthroughs of homes. We see military doing wargaming using gaming technologies. The Mandalorian, I'm sure we all know the Mandalorian is sort of massive sort of revolution in film production or television production, because the Mandalorian is filmed not against a green screen as it would have normally been done, but against a massive LED wall they called a volume, where they were using the Unreal Engine to do real-time simulation of virtual sets. And so when they're filming on the camera, what they're filming is the actors against a virtual backdrop, where they did not have to later go in and swap out the background. It was actually captured in camera, which is especially exciting for the Mandalorian because his costume's so shiny. If they had to, add reflection mapping onto his shiny, costume later, it would have been prohibitively expensive, but they actually just got all that sort of for free by simply using this volume. And the reason it's so exciting is not only were they using, real-time game tech on the set of a movie, but what it really means is you're starting to get these new virtual backlots or virtual sets, where you can imagine to create that television show, they would build out the environments for all these different sets to be used for filming the show. But once you've got the set done in the virtual world, why not just turn it on and let players go in there and walk around and start to now build games in those same environments? Or in talk about UGC, open up to your fan community, let your fans create their own content inside the exact same environments that are literally used for filming the television show. And so I think that's where we're going to start to see this really interesting convergence is, we talk about the metaverse. I think the metaverse is going to be this interesting convergence point between building virtual worlds that are tied to sort of IPs and entertainment properties that span games and television and film and so forth, where you can open up an environment and let people get in there and start to create your own content. And I think that's where things start to get really fascinating.
Yeah, definitely, and it's growing very fast. I mean, there was a whole wing at the recent marketing event in Las Vegas that was only about XR, and multiple companies showcasing how you can do motion with your phone, grabbing your face, and implement that in real time. And then there's gaming companies being poached by these entertainment businesses. So definitely, like for us, we're game devs. We hear about all these new techs, but ultimately it's about building a good gameplay. So what would be the advice for game devs that are starting today, or that have been grinding for a few years and they're still hoping for success? What would be the number one advice? So obviously we've talked about a bunch of them already, yeah, which is launch first, iterate often, listen. But maybe we can go more on a tangent of like how to build a team and how to make that successful.
Yeah, I was just going to say, again, putting my investor hat on, when we're looking at game companies, we rarely have the opportunity to invest in a company after the game's already gone live, because by that point, they don't need our money anymore. And so we're typically investing in companies before they go live, which means we don't have any numbers to look at. We can't make a decision based on the success of their game. So the only thing we can look at is their team. And so team and team culture become really the only thing we're sort of making a decision based on, because ideas will change. We know that. So we're rarely betting on ideas. We're usually betting on the team behind the idea. And so team and team culture matters a lot. And so in my own career, I've been CEO now of three or four different companies when I count it. And I think the thing I've always focused on the most is the culture of the team that I'm building, and being very deliberate about that culture, and really thinking to yourself, what kind of a culture do I want? And having a very strong opinion on that, being able to explain to my employees what the culture here, is or should be, and then being able to use that as a filter when you're hiring to say, okay, well, that's a person I'm not going to hire because that's not the culture. They're not going to fit our culture. And so what do I mean by good culture? In my mind, a good culture is transparent, where people on the team are open with each other and honest and don't feel like they have to, hide information. Safe, people feel they can make creative, especially when you're doing creative, when you're trying to reward innovation and creativity. If someone feels like they're going to get punished for making a risky creative choice, as opposed to celebrated for failing, that's a real challenge. Where the team really has each other's backs, where instead of this notion of I'm not going to help you because that's not my job, the sense of like, oh, please let me help you because we're all in it together, where the team is aligned. There's a very strong shared vision. They're all working toward together, and everyone feels like they're on the same page toward it. You can tell when you're visiting a company that has a healthy culture, because people there are motivated, they're energized, they're excited. There's a palpable sense of energy. And you can tell when you visit a company that has a poor culture, because there's a sense of people are not collaborating. There's that lack of energy and buzz just isn't there. And that's matters. And so I would say, as a game developer, many of us came to the game industry because we want to make games, but the thing they don't tell you is, to make great games, you have to have great teams. And so the art of making great games is really a people art, not so much a technology art, where the art of building and managing a team and encouraging your colleagues and being able to kind of collaborate and communicate, those are the most important skills. From those come great technology, great gameplay, great art, and so forth.
And from my side, I saw both sides of the story, which is companies failing because of culture that was just draining money out of the company and not necessarily putting it in the product, versus other companies that saw that, decided to pivot the company, flip out 30% or 50% of their workforce to really refine their culture, and then being able to go in the right direction and grow the company afterwards. Fantastic advice. So, we're gonna have a bit of time for questions, definitely. But the Andreessen Horowitz A16Z, it's a multi-billion-dollar fund. But you've just started a new program which is called SMART, which is dedicated for game developers. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about that before we go to
Sure.
questions.
So SMART is our version of an entrepreneur in residence program, but you're not literally in residence. So you can almost think of it as like Y Combinator for games through A16Z. So we've announced this program where we basically do $1 million checks for, I think roughly 7% of a company. And it is designed to be a much simpler, lower barrier process than going the traditional fundraising route. And so and it's meant to be appealing to entrepreneurs who want to start a company but don't yet have the whole company set up. You don't necessarily have maybe even your legal incorporation. You don't have a whole team hired. You're not ready for the full fundraising route, but you have an idea. You have a strong track record. You're ready to start a company. This is our program for that. And so, like I said, it really is almost like a Y Combinator, but we're looking for specific game entrepreneurs.
So if you're looking for a good board member that has a lot of expertise and experience, obviously James is here. If you have a good product or a good team, definitely you should talk to him, and hopefully it's going to be successful. And you also have very good colleagues with you that have a lot of expertise and experience that can bring a lot of advice to any company that is required to go forward. So we have time for some questions. Please raise your hand. We're going to have a microphone that's going to move around for you to ask questions. Obviously, there's a lot of side that we went through the last 40 minutes, but now the time is yours, so don't hesitate to raise your hand. You have your chance. Okay, so let me move forward with that then. So, like $1 million for 7% is quite a lot of money, right? So what kind of studio would fit in that scope of company they would like to move forward with that?
So I guess I should start by saying up to $1 million.
Yeah,
So it doesn't
okay.
have to be $1 million. And yeah, the other thing I would say is it actually goes fast. As soon as you've hired, a few engineers and you've, gotten yourself maybe a space, that's a year's worth of burn. So it does go fast.
And so for anyone that is online, obviously you can reach to James. So how can we reach you? How can we get in
Yeah. So
contact
my
with you?
email's not here. You're welcome to email me directly. My email is really simple. It's jamesg@a16z.com.
There we go.
And I'm on
There you have it.
LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn and so forth.
So thank you so much, James, for being here today. So that concludes the multiplayer track. So please, everyone, have a round of applause.